Well, by golly, we're in October and Halloween is coming up, and my sweetheart wants to watch scary movies sometimes, and it's just in the air. We got pumpkins and candles and stuff, like the pumpkins. So, I did sort of a Halloween talk last year, so I figure I'll do another one this year, just on the issue or the topic of Buddhist supernaturalism. And first and foremost, I would point out that in Buddhism, nothing is really supernatural. That even ghosts or psychic powers or miracles or that kind of a thing, um, they're not really any kind of violation of natural law. That it's all natural. It's just unusual. Let's say paranormal. So maybe I should retitle this as the paranormal in Buddhism or something, but I'm not going to. Just stubborn that way. So there's various kinds of supernaturalism. Um, First and foremost, I guess, would be psychic powers, miracles, and magic. So I guess I can start with that. And I mean, there's plenty of mention of psychic powers in in Buddhism, like in ancient Indian Buddhist texts. Although almost always it's referring to like yogis or swamis, meditators, renunciants who have cultivated psychic powers through meditation. Not a whole lot of chanting involved, no magical, actions that have to be performed. It's just that some people, through meditation, they just develop these powers called abhinya, and they can become clairvoyant, they can read minds, they can manifest objects, manifest multiple copies of their own body, that kind of a thing. And it's not just Buddhists that can do it, and Brahmins can do it. Just about anybody who practices the lifestyle and the meditation can develop these things. um, Although there's not much mention at all of any kind of magic outside of this Indian yogic tradition. One possibility would be the Atharva Veda, and in the Buddhist time, in the early Buddhist texts, they're talking about the three Vedas, which is Rig, Sama, and Yajur. But at some point after the Buddhist time, apparently, a fourth Veda was added called the Atharva Veda, which consists largely of magic spells. And even though it wasn't considered one of the four Vedas in the Buddhist time, there are texts, ancient Indian Pali texts, warning monks, don't practice Atharva magic. That it's just sort of a digression. It has nothing to do with actual Dharma. So I just leave it alone. The only I read the Atharva Veda a long time ago when I was in college, and there's only one magic spell, or it's not even a spell, it's just some magic thing that I still remember just because it stuck in my mind as a college student. And that is, if you take the bone of a peacock or a hyena and you cover it with gold and strap it to your arm, you will become irresistible to members of the opposite sex. And I remember for a long time I was thinking, well, hyena bones are probably hard to come by in America, but you can probably get a peacock bone somewhere. I was willing to give it a shot, but I just never got around to it. But monks are just warned, don't bother with fortune telling, astrology, Atharva magic, any interpretation of dreams, any kind of spells that will cause women to get pregnant easier. Definitely you don't do any kind of black magic. That's just wrong. Um, in the Digha Nikaya, I think, there is repeated mention of things like in Burmese Pali it would be called Tirasana Weza. That's Pali with a Burmese accent. That it's like animal knowledge. It's just beneath a monk. He shouldn't bother with it. And one of them is consulting a woman in trance, like a spirit medium. That's just don't bother with that kind of stuff. So the Buddha was kind of radical with regard to just avoiding any kind of hocus pocus kind of stuff for various reasons. One is just a digression. Another, it can cause the sangha to get a bad reputation. You know, monks can be led astray and then just start practicing magic. Like, what was it? Milarepa was like that in Tibetan Buddhism. He started off as a kind of sorcerer. You know, he became a kind of sorcerer monk for the purpose of getting revenge on his relatives who had swindled his mother out of all of her property. And so, you know, he was able to conjure up these, I can't remember, they're giant centipedes or something, or scorpions or something, that destroyed his uncle, his evil uncle's home with everybody inside of it during a feast or something. And it was only after that that he realized that he was doing wrong, and he tried to become a good monk after that. So there is some kind of mentions of it especially in Tibetan Buddhism, but in Indian Buddhism, especially Theravada, it's really downplayed and discouraged. Any kind of like witchcraft kind of a stuff, sorcery. Even a monk who does have psychic powers is not supposed to show them off to lay people. You know, he can admit that he's got them to another monk, especially if it's his teacher. But it's just something that, I mean, Buddhism is really radical in that it's just bare bones, stripped down, or at least it started out this way. And you just don't mess with that stuff. It's irrelevant to becoming enlightened. So, ghosts, on the other hand, there's quite a lot of mention of ghosts, and they've got their own realm. You know, they're like one level or two levels below us. Probably one level below the human level is the ghost, or the Peta Loka. There is an entire text in the Pali Tipitaka, the Peta Watu, or the ghost stories. It's one of the latest additions to the Tipitaka, apparently. So it's probably doesn't go all the way back to the Buddhist time. But one interesting thing about ghosts is that there's this continuum. It's like a spectrum with ghosts at the bottom and gods at the top, like small g gods. So it's like right in the middle, you can have a being that lives pretty much like a god. I mean, they're beautiful. Maybe they live in a palace in the Himalaya mountains. You know, they've got this retinue of servants. You know, they got pleasure gardens and everything. But there's this one thing that prevents them. Like they always have to be naked, for example. Or there's one of my favorite stories of the ghost stories is there was this woman who was a devout Buddhist, and she was married, and she got seduced. She let herself get seduced, and her friends. She had this retinue of friends. They were going to the monastery to make offerings, or they were on their way back, or something. So all of her friends knew about this. That she messed around with this guy, and then somehow word got out to her husband, and she just swore up and down, like, no, I would never do such a thing. And if I'm lying, may that black dog over there was this big black dog with like cropped ears, or cut off ears, I think. May that dog just tear me apart. And of course the dog didn't. And so the husband believed her. And then all of her friends were like sticking up for her and lying on her behalf and saying that she was a good girl and all that. So after she died, she wound up, because she was for the most part virtuous, she just had that one big misdeed in her life. She was living on the slopes of the Himalaya mountains and the pleasure garden and the palace, and she had the retinue of like these friends that were lying on her behalf. They were all like celestial servants of hers, you know, like this retinue. And the only thing bad was that every night she'd like go into a trance and walk down to this pond, and there would be like this demon dog that would just rip her apart and eat her flesh, and her bones would fall into the pond, and then they would like reassemble, they'd grow new flesh, and then she'd get out of the pond and just go back up to the palace and go back to bed again. That happened every night until finally some heroic king comes and falls in love with her and kills the dog, and then she got to move on to essentially a small g goddess, a Devi. But there's also the kind of ghosts in Buddhism called the hungry ghosts. You get a lot of mention of hungry ghosts. And the Burmese just completely believe in these. It's like everybody knows somebody who's seen one. They were out in the woods fishing or something and they see this hungry ghost. It's all glowing red and it's got a great big belly and a tiny pinhole mouth, or it's got this tiny belly and this huge gaping mouth. That's usually the two ways of describing them. It's like they can't be satisfied. They got this huge hungry belly and they got to eat through this tiny hole. And personally, I'm skeptical, to tell you the truth. I mean, I'm very open-minded with regard to like spirits and apparitions. I think I may have seen a couple of them, but like the whole idea of hungry ghosts, just it goes back to ancestor worship, where it was like the duty of an ancient Indian, especially prehistoric Indian, up until, even today, that you make offerings to your ancestors. And an ancestor that didn't have offerings would be one of these hungry ghosts. That they would be these miserable, destitute spirit beings that were not being supported by their descendants. So there is that. In addition, I maybe I should tell you a couple of ghosts, the two ghost stories, the two ghosts that maybe I've seen. When I was a very small child, we lived in a house that the previous owner, this lady, had died in the house. And when I was like 3-4 years old, I would see this woman, and she would never talk. She'd smile at me. She liked little kids, apparently. She wasn't scary, and I was too young to have learned to be afraid. I just, there's this woman. She comes and sees me sometimes, and she never says anything, but she smiles. And one time she showed me something in the attic. I think I had this dream about her, that she led me into the attic, which was down the hallway from my bedroom. It was like this dorm or attic thing. And she showed me a box of puppies just right inside the door. And I didn't make much of it. It's just, you have dreams that don't necessarily make sense. Although it turned out that the subsequent owners of the house, they tore up the floor in the attic and they found there was this stash of old money. She had been storing her money under a floorboard in the attic. So it might have had something to do with that. My father thought so anyway. But then one time when I was a monk in Burma, it's hard. It's really hard to say for sure. Like the ghost shows, they never catch a ghost. There's so many ghost shows. They got all this equipment and everything. They never catch anything. So, that's the way ghosts are. It's anything paranormal is never going to be proven. It's just one of the aspects of being paranormal. You can prove that it exists, kind of like some kind of psychic abilities, like ESP or something. Somebody can guess consistently above random chance or something like that. But you can't really nail it down as to what exactly it is. And so anyway, I was carrying a 5-gallon bucket of water on my shoulder. And I had just finished taking a bath and was walking up the hill to my cave. And I was going to use the water there for drinking water or something. And you have to look down. I was barefoot almost all the time. So you look down just to make sure you're not going to step on anything icky or anything pointy or a scorpion or something. And as I'm looking down, with the bucket of water on my shoulder, I see somebody, like a young man. I could see him with my peripheral vision well enough to see, he's wearing like the blue shirt and he has black hair and he's a guy and he's relatively young. He comes out into this clearing right in front of me, maybe, 40 feet away. And he takes one look at me and just takes off like a shot, just runs sideways. Not like crab walking, but he runs kind of laterally in front of me and runs behind the congregation hall. And so I'm thinking, anybody who comes to a monastery and takes off running as soon as they see a monk is probably, they're like a thief or something. So I looked around the back and there's nobody there. And I'm looking around everywhere. There's nobody there. I don't see any footprints, although it was hard ground. And then I'm thinking, I mean, he moved awful fast, and there was no sound whatsoever. It was just silent. You know, you'd think you'd hear like the thumping of footprints as somebody's running, 20, 25 feet away from you as they're kind of coming this way, almost towards you to get behind the building. And yeah, it was strange. I mean, I wasn't sleep deprived. I was in perfect health. I'm not prone to just spontaneous hallucinations. So that was a strange one. I remember telling these two village ladies that came to visit me that I had seen that, and I was kind of worried I might scare them, but they got kind of excited, and they knew exactly who it was. Supposedly, it was the uncle of one of the two ladies that was there. How he had ordained as a novice at the same monastery I was living at before I ever lived there, and he was very sloppy. I mean, he was living there with his wife in the congregation hall, and people didn't like it much because I mean they're pretty charitable with regard to lax monks, but when you're living there with your wife, that was just too much. And somebody apparently poisoned him, and he dropped out of the monkhood, and while he was sick, and or he was just a novice but still wearing monk robes, and he died shortly afterwards. So they figured it must have been him, but I really don't know. I've had some strange experiences like that. I mean, that's the only apparition I can remember seeing other than the lady when I was very, very small. Um, so let's see. Ghosts and monsters. There, I mean, definitely there's monsters in Buddhism. There's lots of monsters, a whole menagerie of monsters. Like the Nagas, which are like cobra dragons. They've got the Garudas, or the giant birds that live in the Himalayas and are eating the Naga cobra dragons. They've got ogres, or Yaka, who originally I think were probably the the Aboriginal people's pantheon of gods. When the Indo-Aryans invaded India, northwestern India, around 1500 BC, they had their own pantheon. So they weren't interested in changing religions, but they weren't going to just completely disregard the gods of the people already there. So they just kind of relegated them to a kind of a lower status than their own gods. So their gods lived in the heaven of the 33 gods, ruled by Indra, and the one level below that is right in between the human level and the level of the 33 gods. It's the level of the four great kings, and they live on the slopes of the Himalaya mountains. And there's all kinds of monstrous beings there, including Kombandas, which is kind of an interesting one because they're mentioned in the Pali text. Sometimes a monk, especially an arahant, an enlightened monk, would see like a ghost Kombanda. I mean, it was sort of semi-physical. It was like a ghost. And Kombanda, Komba means water pot. It's like a big clay pot. Anda means egg, which is a euphemism for a testicle. So a Kombanda originally was somebody with elephantiasis of the scrotum, where they'd have to like sling their balls over their shoulder to walk around, and somehow that got turned into a monster, which kind of understandable. Uh, yeah, Gandhabas also, or Gandharvas in Sanskrit, are another one of these semi-gods that are also, they can be considered somewhat monstrous and scary. But most of them inhabit the slopes of the Himalaya mountains, so they're not much danger to us. Um, so in Theravada Buddhism, like scriptural Theravada Buddhism, there's just the standard Indian kind of not really supernatural beings, because they have their own natural places. Like a ghost is not supernatural because they've got their own realm. It's just that they're made of a different kind of matter than us. It's like a different vibration, like a more coarse vibration. And most of them can't see humans. I mean, they're in their own world, you know, and that's one thing I've tried to tell Burmese people. It's like most people can't see ghosts, and most ghosts can't see people, but they just don't see it that way because they've got their own like traditions. There is a kind of interesting ghost that is not mentioned in the Pali text, I'm pretty sure, but the Burmese believe in them just to the point of being terrified of going through forests at night. There were some of these, they were called the Ye, and they're a kind of ghost, according to the Burmese, but they're big and they're hairy and they smell bad and they live in forests, which to me sounds more like a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot than it does a ghost. But if it is a kind of ghost, that would explain why nobody catches Bigfoot, because they can just phase out and in. They can just disappear. You know, they can become invisible and so forth. So, but I lived in this forest that supposedly was infested with these Thaye. I never saw one. I'm very skeptical of their existence out there. But some people, I remember one village woman had to come tell me there was like some kind of phone call, or there was something was up, some kind of important news. So she had to come after dark to my cave to tell me about it. I don't remember what it was, but I mean she was just terrified. I mean she was just white, and she's usually pretty brown, but I mean she was just pale, just obviously in a state of just fear, because she's afraid of the ghosts and the monsters, especially the Ye that live in that forest. But the Burmese, they are Theravada Buddhists, possibly the most Buddhist people in the world, and bless their hearts. But even though they're Theravada Buddhists, they still have their own indigenous traditions. It's like um, they were like animists, or and a kind of polytheist before they converted to Buddhism. Like the ancestral religion of Burma was the Nat cult, which still exists in Burma. It's not taken as seriously as it used to be, but it was all these Nats that were worshipped or propitiated were people like heroic, magnanimous, great-souled people who died a violent death, and that causes them to be a sane, or sane means green, so they're like a green spirit, which makes them more powerful and more dangerous than someone who dies of natural causes. And so they became like gods, apparently, especially the 30 or 31 Nats in the Nat cult. Each one had their story of how they were this person, and they got flung into a fire because they refused to marry so and so by the king's daughter, or whatever. So there is that, and then when the Burmese became Buddhist, Theravada Buddhist, Saka, king of gods, just got kind of transplanted into the Nat cult as the leader of the Nats. He became their king. And the Burmese also just thoroughly believe in witches, even though ghosts are mentioned in the text, petas, but witches, I do not recall. I assume there's mention of witches in, like, at least in the commentarial literature, but I cannot think of a single witch story in a Buddhist text, or even a commentary to a Buddhist text. But in Burma, this is just a proverb in Burma that 1 in 7 houses houses a witch, and people just thoroughly believe in witches too. A lot of people will have magic tattoos to protect them from hexes and the evil eye and so forth. And I've heard some pretty strange stories about witches in Burma. Like one of my teachers, he was the abbot of the last monastery I stayed at before I stopped being a monk, and he was one of my teachers. He was participated in my ordination ceremony just 30 years before that. One time he was telling me in all seriousness about how there was this guy in Burma, and a witch's daughter fell in love with him, but he didn't want to have anything to do with her. Not knowing that her mother was a witch, just maybe she wasn't his type or something. So she goes boo-hooing to her mama, the witch, And shortly after that, starts getting these really intense pains in his stomach. So finally, he goes to the hospital, and they X-ray him, and for some reason, he's got a wooden shoe in his stomach, and I mean, it was too big for him even to swallow it. So they figure, well, this is pretty serious, and they cut him open and they extract the shoe. Then they sew him back up again, and while he's still in the hospital bed on the mend, he starts getting really intense pains in his stomach again. So they do another X-ray and they find that he's got another shoe. Maybe it was the mate to the first one. I don't know. But then they realize, this is not a medical matter. This is magic. This is witchcraft. And so they call in an Apolan Seah, which in Burma, again, this is sort of incidental to Buddhism, kind of incidental. You've got these Sayas, which means like a master. They're like a sorcerer or a wizard or something. And you've got two kinds. You've got the Outland Sayah, the lower path wizards, and then you've got the Apolan Sayah, which is, the white wizards, the above path wizards. And the Outland Sayahs, they do black magic. They can mess people up, sort of like male witches, I guess. But the Apolan Sayahs are Buddhist, and so they use like Buddhist chants and certain little ceremonies that are not in conflict with Buddhism. They called in one of these Apolan Sayahs for this guy with the second shoe in his stomach. And at first, when the Apolan Sayah would just touch him, the guy would be screaming in pain. But finally, just through whatever he did, I don't remember. Sometimes they can write diagrams on paper and then burn it and do something, smear the ashes on their forehead, or these kind of things. Just little magical actions that, if you believe in them, they work. And somehow, just the actions themselves are kind of a gimmick that kind of channels your belief in the possibility of it, or the reality of it, to make it actually functional in some way. So yeah, so the guy finally got cured. That was a story told me by a senior Burmese Sayadaw. And then when I moved to this cave, the same cave where I saw the apparition at a different time, I was warned there were three crater lakes, three extinct volcanoes with little lakes in the middle, like in the caldera. One was a big one that had like some of the world's best natural spirulina, one of the few natural spirulina sources in the world. And then right across the river was another one where they were getting some kind of chemicals out of the water for making laundry detergent or something. I don't know what it was. But then the smallest one off in the distance, I was warned there was these two witches that lived on there, and they were messing. There was a monk who lived in the same cave as me before I got there, who they made him go insane somehow. They did some kind of spell on him because he slighted them or insulted them or something. So people will, in all seriousness, will give you warnings. Like I was warned about assaults are a big deal in Burma, which is a kind of guardian spirit of either some sort of underground treasure or just some natural formation like a waterfall or a cave or something like that. I've lived in forests inhabited by those also. Also, they've got alchemists in Burma, or I guess an adept alchemist would be called a Weza. They supposedly, they become almost immortal. They get psychic powers and so forth, not through, Buddhist meditation, but through either using mercury, or what's the other metal they use? Iron, I think. You got iron alchemists, mercury alchemists. Then they've got what's called an in alchemist, which an in is just a kind of mystical diagram with these symbols on it. It looks kind of like a tic-tac-toe board with like little symbols in some of the holes. And there's also one that uses mantra, I think. So they got those. Also, they've got necromancers, and it's kind of interesting. There's a certain monk. Maybe I shouldn't mention who he was. He was semi-famous. I've written about him before, and he had this meditation method that involved breathing really hard, and I didn't think it was legit. And I actually told him, I went to one of his retreats and told him, I mean, people are breathing so hard, they're just hyperventilating and getting drunk on oxygen, and then they're like flipping out and laughing and crying and just flopping around and howling like dogs and stuff. And he didn't believe me. But then some young monk at the time, this was back in the like the mid 90s, early to mid 90s, some younger Burmese monk wrote a book, sort of like a whistleblower kind of book, saying that this monk was actually a necromancer, which necromancy in Burma, apparently ghosts or ghost-like beings feed on raw meat and raw blood. And that this goes all the way back to ancient Indian belief also. For example, there's a rule of monastic discipline saying that a monk is not allowed to eat raw meat or drink raw blood unless he is possessed by a spirit. And so that this belief that these spirits, at least some spirits, feed on raw meat and raw blood goes all the way back to very ancient times. So the Burmese necromancers, they just set out raw meat and raw blood. They'll set it out in skulls or bowls or something. And then once the ghosts start jonesing on it, they start relying on the necromancer for their source of blood, then he can start commanding them. Say, okay, you want your blood tonight? You're going to have to go mess up so-and-so, kind of a thing. And the interesting thing to me, or one interesting thing, is that this young monk who wrote this whistleblower book was actually the infamous Uwirathu, who later became famous for his anti-Muslim movement in Burma, like the resistance of the Burmese Buddhists against their country being essentially infiltrated, taken over by Islam. He was on Time magazine. It was like what was it, in the face of Buddhist terrorism or something like that. But he wrote this book calling out this other Sayadaw for being a necromancer and like a black magician. So there's lots and lots of that. It's more in the traditional peripheral stuff to Buddhism than being like mainstream, like scriptural Buddhism. It's just not in the scriptures, this kind of stuff. But probably they've got a lot of it in Thailand. They just got a lot of it in Asia in general, just a belief in magic and so forth. I remember one time I was living in a big school monastery in town when I was a young monk. And this guy, I can't remember if he was from Hong Kong or Singapore. Let's say Singapore. And he ran this company. I think he owned a company that made kilns for drying lumber. And he was complaining to me about how hard it is to become successful in business in a place like Singapore, because the people who are already at the top can afford the best wizards. So if you're just like a startup, you're just starting a new business, you're not rich yet, you can only afford, second or third rate wizards to help you to become prosperous and, outcompete your competitors and so forth. And it just seemed like it was unfair to him. It was like the cards were stacked against you, because he just couldn't afford the best kind of wizard. But I don't know about communist China, but the holdouts of pre-communist China, like in Taiwan and Singapore, so forth, they still have this same kind of belief system that the Burmese and probably the Thais also have, just pervaded by paranormal phenomena and invisible beings and so forth. And as for myself, I mean, I'm kind of skeptical with regard to specific stories. Like the wooden shoe. I mean, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen. I have no idea. I mean, I've seen no proof of anything like that. And it may be that the paranormal is of such a nature that there'll never be real, conclusive proof of any of it. But still, I mean, we're living in a vast universe way beyond our capacity to perceive how vast it is. And I'm not even talking about how many light years distant the edge of the universe is, assuming that it even has an edge. Just, what's in front of our face, most of it we can't see. So, I mean, and then there's like an infinite number of universes, just, or variations on the same kind of universe, just all around us, probably. I certainly believe that. I think it's likely anyway. It seems more likely than that this is the only reality there is. This world with bookcases and glasses of apple juice and stuff. So there's just all around us. There's like influences that can influence us. They can seep through. They can get through the cracks in the rules, cracks between the rules, in order to have what do you say? Just manifest in this version of reality. And it's always going to be an outlier. It's always going to be considered paranormal. Just these bleed throughs from other versions of reality, or just some people. I have this idea that modern Western people, in order to function effectively in the modern West, where everything is very precise, there's lots of well-defined rules, like laws of physics that have been discovered or perceived, and so we've got our consciousness is just like finely tuned to this one wavelength of reality. It's like very finely tuned, like a radio. Whereas small children or people from pre-modern civilization, especially like hunter-gatherer societies or something, they might have a more fuzzy bandwidth of what they're able to perceive, and they might be much more able, like a Burmese villager, for example, much more able to perceive ghosts or to practice successful witchcraft or whatever, just because they're not as bound or restricted into this one version of reality, this one very precisely defined version of reality. So that's my Halloween talk, and anyone that has any questions, feel free to ask them, and maybe I'll get around to answering them in the next Q&A, and be happy.